Imagine a single moment in history where a small, almost undetectable act of defiance could have prevented the deaths of millions, altered the course of a world war, and saved the very soul of a nation. We are not talking about a battlefield victory. We are talking about a pair of leather briefcases, a bomb, and a single, catastrophic mistake. For decades, we have focused on the date, July 20th, 1944. We know the name, Operation Valkyrie. We know the intended victim, Adolf Hitler. But the real story is not just about a ticking time bomb in a military briefing room. The real story is about the chilling, universal pattern of failure when the righteous attempt to eliminate the powerful tyrant. This plot, orchestrated by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and his Confederates, was not just a historical footnote. It was the ultimate high-stakes gamble against absolute evil. What drove these men, who wore the same uniforms as the regime they despised, to take this suicidal path? And more importantly, how does their tragic, magnificent failure connect to a century of similar shadow wars against unhinged power? Today, we are going deeper than the explosion at the Wolf's Lair. We are analyzing the blueprint of resistance, the psychology of the conspirators, and the eerie, predictable reasons why plots like Valkyrie, from the attempts on Napoleon to the earlier failures against Hitler himself, so often collapse, leaving only a blood-soaked legacy. This is the shadow war waged by history's reluctant heroes, and the price they paid to reclaim their moral ground. Part 1. The Blueprint of Resistance, setting the stage for Valkyrie. To truly understand the weight of Operation Valkyrie, one must first grasp that this was not a spontaneous decision born of panic. It was the meticulous culmination of years of failed attempts and growing moral revulsion within the Wehrmacht, the very core of the German military machine. For men like Stauffenberg, their awakening was gradual, a creeping realization that their loyalty was owed not to a charismatic leader, but to a violated code of honor and the German state itself. Initially, many officers accepted Hitler's early successes, believing he was restoring national pride. But as the full horror of the Eastern Front unfolded, and as reliable reports of the systematic extermination of Jews and other groups reached the high command, the moral compromise became untenable. The plot needed more than courage. It required an organizational framework. That framework was found in an existing contingency plan, Operation Valkyrie. This was an official, legitimate plan designed by the Army Reserve to maintain control of the government and vital infrastructure in the event that the disruption of Allied bombing raids led to a breakdown of civil order or an uprising by foreign workers. The conspirators, chief among them General Friedrich Ulbricht, saw in this administrative document a Trojan horse. They meticulously amended the orders, substituting Hitler's death for the fictional civil unrest event, transforming a defensive military exercise into the framework for a revolutionary coup d'etat. The logistics alone were dizzying. Imagine coordinating hundreds of officers across a vast wartime empire, all of whom had to be convinced to execute treasonous orders the moment news of Hitler's death arrived. The conspiracy was a network of moral conviction, linking former mayors, diplomats, and high-ranking generals, all working under the cloak of routine military duty. The entire operation was predicated on a single necessary condition: the unquestionable demise of Adolf Hitler. If he survived, the entire complex domino structure would not just fail, it would instantly reverse course, turning the plotters into the hunted. The stakes were absolute. Success meant peace and an attempt to salvage Germany's honor. Failure meant the Gestapo, torture, and a dishonorable death. Part 2. The Moment of Collapse, the Catastrophe of July 20th, 1944. The selection of Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg as the assassin was a matter of grim necessity. As the chief of staff to the commander of the replacement army, he was one of the very few high-ranking plotters with direct, regular access to Hitler. He was also a decorated, severely wounded war hero, having lost an eye, a hand, and 2 fingers in Africa, a physical toll that paradoxically gave him a reputation for unshakable resolve. The plot's repeated failures leading up to the final attempt, several aborted attempts due to last-minute changes in location or the absence of Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, whom the plotters also wanted to eliminate, only amplified the pressure. The ultimate setting was the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily fortified headquarters in East Prussia. On July 20th, Stauffenberg carried 2 explosive packages, each primed with a chemical fuse designed to ignite in 10 minutes. However, while preparing the bombs in an anteroom, he was rushed and only managed to arm one of the 2 charges. This single critical shortfall, a reduction of explosive power by half, was the first fatal flaw. The second, and perhaps the most decisive, was a last-minute change of venue. The briefing was moved from Hitler's usual underground concrete bunker to a lighter wooden barracks above ground. The bunker, being small and enclosed, would have maximized the blast's pressure wave, guaranteeing a kill. The wooden building, conversely, allowed the force of the blast to dissipate through the open windows and lighter structure.
Stauffenberg, placing the briefcase loaded with the single bomb as close to Hitler as possible, made his excuses and left. The bomb detonated at 12:42 p.m. The heavy, solid oak table upon which the map was spread absorbed the majority of the explosion, acting as a critical shield. Moreover, another officer, finding the briefcase inconveniently placed, had shifted it further along the table and braced it against a heavy support, unknowingly moving it away from Hitler's legs and adding a final layer of protection. When Stauffenberg witnessed the massive explosion, and, relying on the prearranged assumption that no one could survive such a blast, he flew back to Berlin to trigger the coup. But the coup faltered, because the conspirators in Berlin hesitated, awaiting absolute confirmation of Hitler's death. This hesitation proved fatal. Within hours, news spread that Hitler, though shaken and bruised, was alive. Stauffenberg and his inner circle were swiftly arrested that same evening. The Shadow War had lost its defining battle. Part 3. The Precursors. Why are tyrants almost always targeted? The failure of Operation Valkyrie, though deeply tragic, is not a unique event in history. It is a recurring theme in the history of resistance against tyranny. To truly appreciate its significance, we must step back and examine the pattern. Why are such plots almost always doomed to failure? And what does the Valkyrie story reveal about the fundamental nature of the tyrant's security? The answer lies in 2 concepts: the cult of personality's protection and the paranoia of the state. Tyrants, from the Roman emperors to Napoleon and Hitler, instinctively understand that their greatest threat comes not from outside, but from within their inner circle. This understanding drives a relentless institutional paranoia. Hitler, long before Stauffenberg, had already faced numerous assassination attempts, including the famous Berger Braukeller bombing by Johann Georg Elser in 1939. These near misses did not shake his confidence. They solidified his belief in his own providential destiny, while simultaneously fueling an obsessive counterintelligence apparatus, the Gestapo and SS security services, which infiltrated every level of German society and government. This contrasts sharply with the conspirators' own inherent weakness, their moral ambiguity. Unlike external revolutionaries, the internal conspirators are high-ranking officials who must operate within the system. This requires secrecy, which translates to a small, brittle network that cannot withstand mass arrests. The tyrant, meanwhile, has the resources of the entire state to build layers of protection, constantly changing schedules, randomized routes, double-checking of security details, and a carefully cultivated environment of informal surveillance, where every officer fears reporting the misdeeds of another, but fears being accused of misdeeds even more. The crucial difference lies in the tyrant's ability to leverage the emotional weight of the cult of personality. For the average soldier or bureaucrat, a coup attempt is not just a political shift. It is an act of sacrilege against a perceived divine or historically destined leader. This cult creates a moment of paralyzing hesitation, as seen in Berlin when the generals feared giving the final order without concrete proof. Part 4. The Inevitable Reckoning. The failure of Operation Valkyrie was followed by an event that, in its cold savagery, cemented the fate of the conspirators and serves as the grim epilogue to the entire saga: the Bloody Purge. Hitler, surviving the blast, saw this plot not as a warning, but as a divine affirmation of his own invincibility and a betrayal that justified total ruthlessness. What followed was a witch hunt known as Action Gitter, or Operation Grid, that swept up thousands of suspects. The methods of punishment were deliberately degrading and theatrical. Stauffenberg and his closest collaborators were summarily executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the Bender block mere hours after their capture. Others, including Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, were subjected to the Volksgerichtshof, or People's Court, presided over by the fanatical Judge Roland Freisler. These were not trials in any recognizable legal sense, but televised choreographed humiliations designed to destroy the defendant's honor before their lives were taken. Freisler would scream abuse at the accused, who were often deprived of their belts and forced to wear ill-fitting clothes. The sentences were carried out by the most horrific means, hanging them slowly with piano wire from meat hooks. The entire process was filmed so that Hitler himself could watch the final demise of those who dared to challenge him. Despite the plot's failure to kill Hitler, its legacy is not of defeat, but of profound moral triumph. The conspirators, knowing the inevitable outcome, acted not for political success, which they must have known was a long shot, but for moral redemption. By taking action, they proved to the world and to future generations that there was a second Germany, a Germany of conscience that actively resisted the Nazi horror. Their actions stand as a permanent, powerful rebuttal to the post-war argument that we were just following orders. The men of Valkyrie were soldiers who chose disobedience when obedience became criminal. Their resistance, though failing to change the immediate course of the war, succeeded in recovering the integrity of German resistance in the face of absolute evil, offering a testament to the fact that even in the darkest tyranny, the flame of human conscience can never be truly extinguished.
Conclusion and final thoughts. The true lesson of Operation Valkyrie is complex and disturbing. It reminds us that courage and moral rectitude are often not enough to defeat entrenched absolute power. The assassination of a tyrant is one of history's most difficult feats, requiring not just bravery, but an almost impossible confluence of opportunity, security failures, and flawless execution. The single thin wooden tabletop that separated Hitler from annihilation serves as a chilling metaphor for the fragility of global fate. One armed bomb instead of two, a concrete room instead of wood, a delay in the officer moving the briefcase. Any one of these shifts the weight of history. But the legacy is undeniable. The individuals of the conspiracy, the generals, the diplomats, and the wounded Colonel Stauffenberg chose a painful public death over a comfortable, compromised life. They understood that the most profound act of patriotism is not blind obedience, but the willingness to risk everything, including one's honor and life, to stop a national crime. The shadow war they fought failed to stop the bullet that ended the war, a bullet fired by Hitler himself months later. But it did provide the world with a vital story. It is the story of the moral line in the sand, a reminder that the responsibility for conscience lies with the individual, even when the consequences are inevitable and terrible. I want to know your thoughts on this incredible history. Did the failure of Valkyrie ultimately serve a greater moral purpose by leaving a clear testament of resistance? Or was its political failure simply too high a cost? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to dive deeper into the full psychological profiles of the men who planned this incredible plot, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. The dawn of the atomic age. The year is 1939. Europe stands on the brink. But in the laboratories of the Third Reich, a different kind of war is brewing. A silent, terrifying race for the ultimate weapon.
The discovery of nuclear fission by German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in late 1938 had unknowingly opened a Pandora's box. The possibility of an atomic bomb, a weapon of unimaginable destructive power, was suddenly, chillingly real. Both the Allies and the Axis understood the stakes. The side that controlled the atom would control the world. For the Nazi war machine, this was not merely a scientific pursuit. It was a desperate military objective. Their scientists, led by figures like Werner Heisenberg, were tasked with harnessing the immense energy released by splitting the uranium atom. To achieve a sustained nuclear reaction, which is the precursor to a bomb, two critical components are necessary: fissile material like uranium-235 and a moderator. A moderator's job is to slow down the fast-moving neutrons released during fission, making them more likely to hit other uranium nuclei and sustain a chain reaction. The Germans had two choices for a moderator: graphite or heavy water. The American and British efforts initially favored highly purified graphite. However, a slight miscalculation in an early German experiment led Heisenberg's team to reject graphite, concluding it absorbed too many neutrons. They focused instead entirely on the other, far rarer substance, heavy water. Heavy water, or deuterium oxide, D2O, is chemically identical to ordinary water, H2O, but contains an isotope of hydrogen called deuterium. It is a superb neutron moderator. The problem was its scarcity. Producing even a small amount requires an enormous, sustained electrical output and a vast, specialized industrial facility. Only one place on Earth was producing heavy water in industrial quantities: a fertilizer plant in the remote snowbound mountains of Norway, at a location known as Vemwerk. The Norsk hydro plant at Vemwerk was not built to manufacture weapons. It was a commercial facility, using the abundant hydroelectric power of the region to fix nitrogen from the air for fertilizer. The heavy water was a byproduct, slowly accumulated in an obscure, multi-stage electrolysis cascade deep within the plant. When Norway was occupied by the Germans in April 1940, the Vemwerk facility and its entire stock of heavy water fell straight into Nazi hands. For the Allies, particularly British intelligence, this was a disaster. They knew what the Germans were aiming for. The 1,800 kilograms of heavy water stored at Vemwerk and its constant production of several kilograms per day was the bottleneck of the Nazi atomic program. Without it, the German bomb project would stall, perhaps permanently. Winston Churchill and the British High Command were left with a stark conclusion: the Vemwerk heavy water plant had to be eliminated. This was not a sideshow skirmish. It was a mission to neutralize the most significant strategic weapon threat of the entire war. The fate of the world would depend on a small, isolated complex high on a Norwegian plateau.
Part 2. The genesis of the sabotage. The task of destroying the Vemwerk plant was assigned to the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, Churchill's clandestine organization dedicated to set Europe ablaze. Their mission? To strike behind enemy lines. For a mission of this magnitude, the SOE turned to the Norwegians themselves. The first attempt was codenamed Operation Freshman. Launched in November 1942, it was a massive, high-risk undertaking involving two military gliders towed by bombers carrying 34 British Royal Engineers. Their plan was to land near the target, attack the plant, and then escape into neutral Sweden. The operation was a catastrophic failure. Navigating the treacherous Norwegian terrain in a blackout, the tow ropes snapped. Both gliders and one of the towing bombers crashed violently far from the target. The British survivors, many severely injured, were quickly captured by the Gestapo. Despite being uniformed soldiers, Hitler's commando order was ruthlessly applied. Every single survivor was interrogated and then executed. The tragedy of Freshman underscored the near impossibility of attacking Vemwerk. The German defenses, now on high alert, were formidable.
Following this disaster, the strategy shifted dramatically. Large-scale military operations were out. The SOE realized the only way to succeed was through maximum stealth, employing a tiny team of elite, specialized Norwegian commandos, men who knew the land, the language, and the spirit of resistance. The plan for the second attempt, Operation Gunnerside, was conceived as a surgical strike. It would be carried out by a six-man team of highly trained Norwegian skiers, members of the Norwegian Independent Company 1, better known as Kompani Linkai. These men were mountain-hardened, expert skiers, and crucially, had been trained to survive for months in the wilderness. They were the tip of the spear for the free world. A small advance party, Operation Grouse, had already parachuted into the harsh Hardangervidda Plateau months earlier. Their job was to scout the plant, establish a supply drop zone, and wait out the long, brutal winter for the Gunnerside team. Living in snow caves, subsisting on meager rations, they were the mission's eyes on the ground, enduring isolation and constant danger, maintaining a lonely vigil over the plant below. The 6 members of the Gunnerside team parachuted in February 1943. Landing miles from their intended drop zone, they spent days battling blizzard conditions and treacherous ice, using their exceptional endurance to haul their heavy packs of demolition equipment and supplies across the hostile plateau. Finally, after an agonizing journey, the Gunnerside men linked up with the 4 men of the Grouse team. They were now 10. Their target? The high concentration chamber deep inside the main Vemork factory. Part 3. Infiltration and the silent strike. The Vemork facility was located in an almost impenetrable position. Perched on a cliff 1,000 feet above the valley floor, it was protected on 3 sides by sheer drops. The 4th side was guarded by German sentries, floodlights, minefields, and the only bridge that allowed access from the main road. The bridge itself was constantly patrolled. The combined 10-man team, now commanded by Ronneberg, knew a direct assault was suicide. A key piece of intelligence from the Grouse team was that the Germans had, surprisingly, not guarded the most difficult approach, the deep ravine below the plant. The enemy believed the sheer drop of the gorge and the frozen river at its bottom was a sufficient natural defense. The commandos chose this impossible path. Under the cover of a freezing moonless night, the 10 men began their descent into the ravine. They moved silently, roped together, navigating the icy 600-foot drop. Crossing the frozen Mona River at the bottom, they then faced the most grueling part, a nearly vertical climb up the opposite side of the gorge, 600 feet of slick ice and snow towards the perimeter of the plant. They reached the perimeter fence, not a high one, but a necessary obstacle. Ronneberg and his men cut the wire and slipped into the grounds. The entire area was covered in heavy snow, which helped muffle the sound of their movements, but made every step a monumental effort. The 10 men split into 3 groups: a demolition team, an assault team to provide cover, and a reserve team to guard the escape route. Ronneberg led the demolition team straight for the main building. They found a maintenance tunnel leading down beneath the factory floor. They then crawled through a narrow cable duct which led them right into the heart of the heavy water chamber, the high concentration room. Inside, the room was small, filled with the distinctive low humming of the electrolysis cells, metal tanks lined up in a row, each containing the priceless heavy water. A lone Norwegian maintenance worker named Johansen was inside. He was not a collaborator, simply a civilian on the night shift. As the armed commandos burst in, he reacted not with alarm, but with quiet understanding. When Ronneberg quickly explained the nature of the mission, Johansen immediately complied, pointing out the most critical cells to plant the charges on and helping to ensure no civilian life was endangered.
The men worked with surgical precision, planting small, powerful plastic explosives, plastique, on the 20 most crucial stainless steel electrolysis cells. They cut the fuses to a mere 2 minutes, the shortest possible time, to ensure the maximum element of surprise. The stakes were too high for a longer delay. With the charges set, Ronneberg lit the fuses. Part 4. Detonation and the Escape. The demolition team raced out of the chamber, scrambling back through the cable duct and into the night, signaling to the other teams. They had less than 2 minutes. The air was still, cold, and silent. Then a muted explosion. It was not the roar of a spectacular Hollywood bomb. It was a series of quick, sharp thuds, muffled by the concrete walls of the chamber. Inside, the charges had done their work with chilling efficiency. The bottoms of the 20 electrolysis cells were instantly ruptured. The small but critical store of heavy water, a total of 900 kilograms, began to drain away, mixing with ordinary water and flowing harmlessly into the factory's drains. The alarm was raised almost instantly. German guards rushed to the scene, but the commandos, having prepared for months for this exact moment, were already gone. They raced back towards the ravine, descending with ropes into the deep darkness. The Germans, initially panicked, assumed the sabotage must have been carried out by a large military force attacking from the bridge or the road. Their security protocols directed them to search the perimeter and the main road network. They entirely missed the escape route down the gorge. The 10 commandos, reunified at the bottom of the ravine, began the most grueling phase of the operation, the long-distance escape across the Hardanger-Vita Plateau. Their objective was to reach the safety of the neutral Swedish border, over 250 miles away. They stripped off their military gear, donned civilian ski clothes, and began to ski across the vast, frozen wilderness. They knew every minute counted. Thousands of German troops would soon be mobilized to hunt them down. The chase that followed was a masterclass in survival and evasion. The commandos skied for days on end, averaging 30 to 40 miles a day, battling blizzards, subsisting on the meager rations they had carried, and navigating by compass across the featureless expanse. They became ghosts in the snow. The Germans, realizing their mistake, deployed an overwhelming force, over 3,000 soldiers, along with air reconnaissance. But the Norwegians were in their element. They knew the terrain intimately, understood the local weather, and left virtually no traceable tracks, burying their skis under the snow when they rested. Ultimately, after a harrowing 14-day trek, 5 of the 6-man gunnerside team, led by Ronneberg, successfully crossed into Sweden. The rest of the team split up to further confuse the pursuit. 2 members remained in Norway to continue resistance work, and 3 others crossed the mountains and eventually made their way back to England via submarine. The mission was a complete success. Not a single commando was lost, and the entire heavy water production line at Vemork had been utterly shut down. Part 5. The Final Blow and Legacy. For the Allies, the immediate reports confirmed the success of Operation Gunnerside. For the Germans, it was a massive, costly setback. The destruction of the heavy water stock and the extensive damage to the electrolysis chambers meant the Nazi nuclear program was delayed by nearly a year. Werner Heisenberg and his team were forced to wait, scrambling to secure alternative resources. However, Allied intelligence soon discovered a terrifying development. The Germans had begun to repair the facility. By the summer of 1943, under intense pressure from Berlin, the heavy water production was slowly starting up again. The prospect of the German bomb was back on the table. This time, the Allies would not risk another commando operation. The next action would be decisive and blunt. An aerial bombardment. In November 1943, over 150 American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers launched a massive daylight raid on Vemork. The bombing crippled the power station and fertilizer plant, causing massive damage and guaranteeing that no industrial-scale heavy water production could ever occur there again. However, the bombing had a dangerous side effect. Recognizing the complete loss of the facility, the German High Command ordered the remaining stock of heavy water, along with all the specialized equipment, to be loaded onto a train and transported to Germany for final assembly and experimentation. The mission was not over. The remaining Norwegian resistance fighters, including Knut Kaukolid, who had stayed behind, knew that if the heavy water reached Germany, the delay bought by Gunnerside would be for nothing. A final, desperate act was required. Knut's team tracked the shipment. On the night of February 20th, 1944, they snuck aboard the ferry carrying the train cars across Lake Tinn. They planted a time delay charge in the hold, ensuring the detonation would occur in the deepest part of the lake. In the early morning, the ferry sank, taking with it the last remaining reserves of heavy water and crucial German equipment. With the ferry sunk, not only the heavy water, but the last hope for the Third Reich's atomic ambitions.
Part 6. Changing the course of history. The combined successes of Operation Gunnerside and the subsequent sinking of the ferry guaranteed the failure of the Nazi nuclear program. Historians and scientists widely agree that the cumulative effect of these acts of sabotage was profound. The constant setbacks meant that Germany never achieved a sustained chain reaction, and the scientific effort was instead scattered and poorly funded. While the Manhattan Project in the United States employed hundreds of thousands of people, the German effort remained a small, almost academic pursuit. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Allies were able to confirm through the capture of key German scientists and documents, Operation Alsos, that the Nazis were still months, if not years, away from developing a working reactor, let alone a bomb. The window of opportunity had been closed by 10 commandos and a submerged ferry. The men of Operation Gunnerside were hailed as heroes, but their mission was largely kept secret until after the war, its significance often eclipsed by the larger battles. Yet, their story remains a testament to the power of a small, highly motivated team against overwhelming odds. Joachim Romberg, Knut Kaukolid, and the rest of the commandos had not merely won a battle, they had won the race for the atomic bomb. They had prevented the darkest weapon of the war from falling into the hands of the darkest regime. The mission was the most dangerous of the war because the consequence of failure was the destruction of the world order as they knew it. It was the untold story of how a handful of skiers navigating the frozen wilderness of Norway achieved the impossible, and in doing so, changed the entire war. The true heroes of the atomic age were not the men who built the bomb, but the men who risked everything to ensure it could not be built by the enemy.